I stood on my porch, hands clenched, staring at the notice nailed to my wooden fence. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, the kind with golden embossing, as if that made its absurdity any more legitimate. Violation: unauthorized landscaping. Fine, $1,500. Deadline for compliance: immediate removal. My front yard garden, the one I had spent months cultivating, the one bursting with tomatoes, bell peppers, and sunflowers reaching toward the sky, was now deemed an eyesore. I exhaled sharply, scanning the letter for a signature. Margaret Holloway, HOA President. Of course, it was her. Margaret had taken over the HOA 2 months ago, sweeping in with a self-important air and a list of improvements to increase property values. What that really meant was squeezing out longtime residents who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. I had ignored her previous memos about mailbox uniformity and driveway colors. But this was different. This was my home, my land, and my work. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The irony wasn't lost on me. For the past 15 years, I had been the city's chief building and zoning inspector. I knew the regulations better than anyone, including whatever overinflated rulebook Margaret was waving around. I had personally signed off on community development plans, reviewed property disputes, and handled hundreds of cases where power-drunk HOA presidents thought they could bulldoze homeowners into submission. But Margaret didn't know that. She assumed I was just another resident who would bow to her authority. I walked to the edge of my yard, where my neighbor, Jim, was already waiting. He held his own HOA notice in his hand, shaking his head. "They hit you too, huh?" he asked. I nodded. "Looks like it." Jim sighed. "Margaret's got it out for you. She's been ranting about your garden for weeks at the meetings. Says it ruins the uniform aesthetic. Uniform aesthetic. The phrase made my stomach turn. My garden wasn't just for show. It was functional. I grew fresh produce, not just for myself, but for the community. Every week, I donated a portion to the local food bank. I had even set up a small wooden stand by my driveway where people could take free vegetables." Jim rubbed his beard. "What are you going to do?" I folded the notice and slid it into my pocket. "Nothing," I said, and when Jim raised an eyebrow, I clarified. "At least not yet." I had learned long ago that the best way to handle people like Margaret was to let them dig their own grave. If she wanted to fight, I'd give her one, but not in the way she expected. The next morning, I sat in on the HOA's monthly meeting. Margaret sat at the head of the long conference table, her platinum blonde bob perfectly in place, a pearl necklace sitting stiffly against her collarbone. She was flanked by her usual group of enforcers, board members who nodded at everything she said. I leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, watching as she droned on about community standards and preserving property values. And she got to my garden. "We have received multiple complaints," she said, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "While we all appreciate home gardening as a hobby, we must remember that front yard gardens disrupt the visual harmony of our neighborhood." I let her talk. I let her smugly announce the upcoming inspections to ensure compliance. I let her lay out the so-called consequences, escalating fines, possible liens, even legal action. I watched the other homeowners shift uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to challenge her outright, but clearly uneasy with the way she wielded her power. When she finally finished, she folded her hands and looked around the room. "Any comments?" I pushed off the wall, walking toward the center of the room. "Just one," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Can you cite the exact ordinance I'm violating?" Margaret's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "It's clearly outlined in our HOA guidelines." "No, I mean an actual municipal ordinance," I interrupted, tilting my head. "Since you're threatening legal action, I assume you've checked city zoning laws." Margaret's eyes flickered to one of the board members, a middle-aged man who suddenly seemed very interested in his notepad. She cleared her throat. "The HOA operates under its own covenants and regulations." I nodded. "That's true, but HOA regulations cannot override city zoning laws." I pulled a folded document from my pocket and placed it on the table. And according to city code, front yard gardens are perfectly legal as long as they do not obstruct sidewalks or public property. The silence in the room was thick. Margaret's face turned a shade of pink that clashed horribly with her pearl necklace. I smiled, slow and measured. I should know, I continued. I wrote that section of the zoning code myself. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret's composure cracked just slightly before she forced a tight smile. Well, this is about aesthetics, not legality. Good, I said. Then you won't be taking any legal action, because you don't have a case. She pursed her lips. There are still fines. Unenforceable ones, I cut in, and any attempt to place a lien on my property would be considered fraudulent under state law. Margaret's grip on her pen tightened. She wasn't used to pushback, and she certainly wasn't used to being challenged so openly. I could see the wheels turning in her head, calculating her next move. I wasn't worried. She was in a corner now, and I had all the time in the world to watch her squirm. As I left the meeting, Jim clapped me on the back. Damn, he chuckled. That was fun to watch. I smirked. Oh, this is just getting started. Margaret wasn't going to back down quietly. I knew that, but I also knew something she didn't. She thought she was fighting a gardener. She had no idea she was fighting the city's chief inspector. Margaret's reaction was predictable. The very next morning, a second notice appeared on my door, this one more aggressive than the first. It cited new infractions: unapproved fencing, improper use of decorative elements, and unauthorized signage. My small wooden produce stand, which had been there for months, was now classified as a commercial structure in violation of HOA guidelines. The fine had doubled, and the threat of further action loomed. It was almost amusing how fast she had scrambled to find something, anything, to exert control. But I had expected it. People like Margaret never accepted defeat. They just doubled down, hoping intimidation would make their problems disappear. I took my time responding. Letting her think she had the upper hand was part of the strategy. I wanted her confident, believing she was tightening the noose. Meanwhile, I gathered documents. My city credentials ensured I had access to more than just the standard municipal codes, archived development plans, old zoning permits, and most importantly, a detailed history of every variance and exception ever granted to the properties in our neighborhood. I spent the next 2 days piecing together a case that would do more than just prove her wrong. It would expose every inconsistency, every selective enforcement, every moment where Margaret had bent the rules to suit her personal vision of control. By the third day, the escalation arrived in the form of 2 uniformed compliance officers sent by the HOA. They were young, early 20s at most, dressed in crisp polos embroidered with the association's logo. They approached my property with the cautious confidence of people who had been given authority but weren't entirely sure how much of it they actually had. One of them, a man named Derek, held a clipboard and took the lead while the other recorded the inspection on a tablet. They informed me, with the kind of rehearsed professionalism that suggested they had practiced this speech beforehand, that my property was in violation of multiple regulations. The garden had to be removed, the stand dismantled, and immediate action was required to avoid further penalties. I let them finish their routine, nodding along as if their words carried weight. When they handed me a printed checklist of violations, I calmly pulled out my own set of documents. The shift in their expressions was almost immediate. The clipboard lowered slightly, the confidence wavered. I explained, in careful detail, how each of their claims directly contradicted city zoning regulations. I pointed out that the garden was not only permitted, but that previous homeowners in the neighborhood had been granted exceptions for similar projects, including decorative landscaping and front yard alterations. Then I introduced the key document, a zoning exception granted by the city years ago, one that legally allowed front yard gardens in designated residential areas. Our neighborhood, due to a historical variance, was one of those areas. Derek looked uneasy. He glanced at his partner, then back at me, shifting on his feet. He mumbled something about needing to check with the HOA board and quickly wrapped up the inspection, promising they would be in touch. I watched them leave, already knowing what would happen next. They would report back to Margaret, who would realize she had sent them into a fight they weren't prepared for. She would fume, dig deeper, and try again. But the problem with power-hungry people was that they always underestimated those who didn't make a show of their authority. Margaret had spent weeks treating me like a stubborn homeowner. She still hadn't realized she was picking a fight with the very person who oversaw the rules she was trying to manipulate. That evening, I saw Margaret patrolling the neighborhood as she often did, clipboard in hand, stopping in front of houses, making notes, and issuing violations with a satisfaction that was almost comical. I knew she was looking for anything else she could pin on me. I let her play her game, knowing she was unaware of the game I was playing in return. I had been digging through HOA records, reviewing previous complaints, and tracking patterns. I found more than I expected. Violations selectively issued to certain residents, approvals fast-tracked for her allies, and fines that conveniently disappeared for homeowners in her inner circle. It was all there, hidden in layers of bureaucracy she never thought anyone would bother to untangle. By the end of the week, she made her next move. A formal letter, hand-delivered by an HOA board member, stated that if my garden and stand were not removed within 48 hours, the association would take direct action to correct the violations. That was her real mistake. Up until now, she had relied on intimidation through paperwork and warnings, but this crossed into illegal enforcement. The HOA had no legal authority to alter private property, and by putting that threat in writing, she had provided me with the exact evidence I needed. I made a few calls that evening. First, to the city's legal department, where I forwarded copies of Margaret's notices and the selectively enforced HOA regulations. Then to the local news station, where an old friend of mine worked as an investigative reporter. Finally, I called a few of my neighbors, the ones who had been quietly frustrated with the HOA, but had never felt they had the power to push back. I told them to be ready. The next morning, I was outside, tending to my garden, when I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. 3 black SUVs, HOA board members inside, and behind them, a truck hauling landscaping equipment. Margaret stepped out, dressed in one of her signature blazers, an air of smug determination surrounding her. The board members flanked her, silent but obedient, as if they were there just for the show. She barely looked at me before waving toward the workers in the truck. "Proceed," she said. I didn't stop them. I didn't need to, because the moment they stepped onto my property, the sound of sirens filled the air. A city enforcement vehicle pulled up, followed by a local news van, and finally, a car from the legal department. Margaret's confidence wavered as an official stepped forward, holding the same documents I had sent the night before. I watched the realization settle into her face. She had just walked straight into a legal trap of her own, making Margaret's smug expression crumbled the moment she saw the city officials stepping out of their vehicle. The lead inspector, a man named Robert Keller, had a presence that demanded attention. He moved with the practiced authority of someone who had spent years enforcing regulations that actually mattered. Behind him, the local news crew was already setting up their cameras, capturing every moment of what was about to unfold. The workers Margaret had hired hesitated, shovels and trimmers in hand, uncertain whether they should proceed. The air crackled with tension as everyone stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Robert approached Margaret first, his gaze shifting from her to the paperwork she clutched in her manicured hands. Without hesitation, he reached for the documents and examined them with a slow, deliberate motion. The silence stretched until he let out a small, unimpressed sigh and folded the papers neatly before tucking them under his arm. Then he turned to the group of landscapers. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the kind of weight that sent a clear message. Any attempt to alter the property of this homeowner would be considered an unlawful act, punishable by legal consequences. The workers exchanged nervous glances before one of them muttered an apology, tossed a shovel back into the truck, and climbed inside. One by one, they followed, their reluctance turning into relief as they realized they wanted no part of what was quickly becoming a very public disaster for Margaret. The HOA board members looked equally uneasy, but none of them dared to move without Margaret's cue. She, however, was still caught between disbelief and fury, her lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. The camera crew had moved in closer, their lenses trained on her as the reality of the situation settled into her stiff posture. Her carefully constructed power trip had just hit an immovable wall. But I wasn't done yet. I pulled out my own folder, thick with documented evidence of her overreach. Violations selectively enforced against homeowners who opposed her, fines issued without proper authorization, fast-tracked approvals for properties owned by her friends, and worst of all, a paper trail of expenses that had no clear justification. Robert gestured for me to proceed. I calmly outlined every unethical, and in some cases, outright illegal action Margaret had taken since becoming HOA president. I explained how she had personally ordered property modifications that extended beyond the HOA's legal jurisdiction, how she had filed reports that contradicted city regulations, and how she had attempted to manipulate zoning laws to fit her personal vision of the community. The news crew recorded every word, the anchor nodding along as if she was already drafting the headline for the evening broadcast. Then came the final blow. Robert revealed that an official complaint had already been submitted against Margaret and the HOA board for regulatory overreach. The city had been receiving reports from multiple residents, many of whom had been afraid to speak up until now. The legal team had found enough grounds to launch an investigation into how the HOA was operating under Margaret's leadership. That meant financial audits, a formal review of every fine and citation issued in the past year, and possible legal consequences for any fraudulent claims. Margaret's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to protest, but for once, she had nothing to say. The board members, sensing the inevitable collapse of the empire she had built on intimidation, began to step back, one by one, as if trying to physically distance themselves from the sinking ship. One of them even muttered something about not knowing the full extent of the policies, a weak attempt to excuse their silence. Margaret turned sharply, expecting their support, only to find that they had already abandoned her. She was alone, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her in real time. She tried to regain control, suggesting that there had been a misunderstanding, that the HOA had only been acting in the best interest of the community. But it was too late. No one was listening. The news anchor leaned in, microphone extended, asking if she had any comment on the unfolding investigation. Margaret turned her head away, refusing to acknowledge the camera, but the damage was already done. The footage would be aired that evening, and by the next morning, every homeowner in the neighborhood would know exactly what had happened here. She had spent months wielding power like a weapon, believing herself untouchable. Now, under the scrutiny of both legal authorities and the public eye, she was no longer the one making the rules. The city officials didn't leave immediately. They stayed long enough to ensure that no further action would be taken against my property, and that my garden and everything else on my land would remain untouched. They reassured the surrounding homeowners that any fines issued under Margaret's administration would be reviewed for legitimacy, and if found fraudulent, would be dismissed entirely. The ripple effect was instantaneous. Homeowners who had once feared the HOA's control were now emboldened. Conversations sparked in small groups, quiet voices rising in volume as people began sharing their own stories, their own frustrations. It was clear that Margaret had made many enemies, and now that her authority was crumbling, they no longer felt the need to stay silent. As the officials wrapped up, Robert turned to me, offering a nod of approval before heading back to his vehicle. The camera crew began packing up, but not before the reporter approached me with a request for an interview. I politely declined for now, knowing that my actions had already spoken louder than any statement I could give. Instead, I turned back to my home, walking past my still thriving garden, the sun catching the leaves and casting soft shadows against the soil. Margaret had thought she could erase all of this with a few documents and a show of force. Instead, she had exposed herself as the true problem in this neighborhood. I could hear her retreating, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she stormed back to her car. The board members followed, some looking resigned, others already whispering amongst themselves, no doubt planning how they would distance themselves from the fallout. The truck that had been meant to dismantle my garden pulled away, its tires kicking up dust as it disappeared down the street. The neighborhood was left in an odd silence, one that felt less like tension and more like the quiet before a storm breaks. I knew this wasn't over. Margaret wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She would try something else, some desperate move to claw back the power slipping through her fingers. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated me from the beginning. And now, as the first real cracks in her authority had been exposed, I was ready for whatever came next. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word had spread fast, helped along by the local news report that aired the previous evening. The footage showed everything. Margaret's failed attempt to remove my garden, the arrival of city officials, and the moment she realized her authority had slipped beyond her grasp. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now openly discussing the possibility of removing her from the HOA board altogether. It was a shift, subtle but undeniable. The fear she had used to keep people in line was dissolving. I went about my morning as usual, tending to my garden, checking the ripening tomatoes, and watering the raised beds. It felt different now, not just because I had won this battle, but because of the quiet sense of victory settling into the neighborhood. People were watching Margaret's next move, waiting to see how she would react to her first real public failure. It didn't take long to find out. That afternoon, another letter arrived. Unlike the others, this one wasn't filled with threats or fines. It was a formal notice from the HOA board, announcing an emergency meeting scheduled for that evening. The agenda was clear. A review of recent enforcement actions, a discussion on legal liability, and, buried at the bottom, a vague mention of leadership concerns. Margaret was already on the defensive, trying to get ahead of what was coming. I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight, but this meeting wasn't just about me anymore. The neighborhood had woken up, and she was no longer in control of the narrative. The community center was packed when I arrived. More people than I had ever seen at an HOA meeting, many of them residents who had never attended before. The usual setup had changed. Chairs were crammed into every available space. People stood against the walls, the air thick with anticipation. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her composure carefully maintained, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her stress. The board members flanking her looked uncomfortable, their eyes darting between the crowd and the documents in front of them. She opened the meeting with a speech, carefully crafted, rehearsed to sound reasonable. She spoke about the importance of maintaining order, about the need for clear community standards, about how misunderstandings had led to unnecessary conflicts. She didn't mention my name directly, but the message was clear. She was trying to reframe the narrative, casting herself as the misunderstood leader who had only been trying to do what was best for the community. But the crowd wasn't buying it. People began to raise their hands, their voices growing stronger with each story shared. A retired couple spoke about the fines they had received for having potted plants on their front steps. A single mother described the harassment she had endured for having a small place at her yard, and a veteran recounted how his request for an accessibility ramp had been denied because it didn't meet aesthetic standards. One by one, residents shared their frustrations, and the tide of the meeting shifted. Margaret tried to interject, to regain control, but the momentum was against her. Then came the real turning point. One of the board members hesitantly cleared his throat and announced that an independent review had begun into the HOA's financial records. He explained that concerns had been raised about how fines were being allocated and how certain expenditures, authorized solely by Margaret, didn't align with the HOA's budget. The room went still. That was the moment Margaret realized she wasn't just losing support. She was losing the very foundation she had built her control upon. Her composure cracked for the first time. She tried to dismiss the review as routine, but the board member pressed on, revealing that outside auditors had been brought in to ensure full transparency. There was no escaping it now. The financial records would tell their own story, and if there were irregularities, there would be consequences beyond just losing her position. The crowd murmured, the energy shifting again, but this time in a way that left no room for doubt. The meeting was no longer about policy disputes or landscaping regulations. It was about whether Margaret had abused her power for personal gain, and the answer was becoming increasingly clear. Someone in the back of the room called for a vote of no confidence, and the room erupted in agreement. Margaret tried to fight it, tried to insist that this was all a misunderstanding, but it didn't matter. The board, recognizing that their own credibility was now on the line, agreed to an immediate vote. It was over within minutes. A landslide decision. Margaret Holloway was officially removed as HOA President. She didn't stay to hear the rest. She stood, stiffly, her face pale, and left without a word, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The weight of her downfall settled over the room, but not with silence, with relief. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the residents again, not just one woman's personal kingdom. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders finally ease. This had started as a fight over my garden, but it had ended as something much bigger. The neighborhood had stood up, had realized that they weren't powerless, and had taken back their voice. Margaret would be back, I had no doubt. People like her never truly faded away quietly. But whatever influence she once had was gone, and now the community was watching. No more secret fines, no more unchecked authority. The game had changed, and as I walked home, past my still-standing garden, I knew that no matter what happened next, I had already won.